session of the UK Trade and Business Commission, which is going to be focusing on the UK-Australia trade deal. My name is Caroline Lucas MP, and I've been asked to chair this session, which I'm very pleased to do. And we're going to have 5 witnesses with us today who will be giving evidence. And the first thing to do really is to simply invite each of you to give us just a minute's worth overview, if you might, in terms of the background that you're coming from. And I will start, if that's all right, please, with Dmitry Grozoubinski.
Hi, thanks so much for having me, Caroline. My name is Dmitry Grozoubinski. I was a former Australian trade negotiator. I currently run a trade consultancy called Explain Trade. And one of the things I've done through that consultancy is provided training on trade policy and negotiations to a lot of UK civil servants and civil servants from around the devolved administrations. So in some ways, I have a horse on both sides of this race, and I'm happy to help in any way I can. Thanks so much.
Lovely, thank you so much. And Séan?
Good morning. Séan Rickard. I was formerly Chief Economist with the National Farmers Union between 1987 and 1995. I then left to become an academic and became director of the Cranfield School of Management. Meanwhile, I was a government academic advisor on agriculture and rural affairs, and I am now retired to run my own consultancy, which advises on really agri-food matters.
Lovely, thank you so much. And David Bowles.
Thanks, Caroline, and thank you very much for inviting the RSPCA to this. I'm David Bowles. I head up the RSPCA's Public Affairs and Campaigns work. I've been working on WTO issues for 25 years, attended many WTO ministerials, and also we work obviously closely with RSPCA Australia, which has given us an insight from both sides on the Australia deal. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Jilly?
Good morning, and thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to this commission. I'm a farmer. I'm a Suckler beef producer, an arable farmer in Devon, farming in partnership with my husband and son. We are regenerative farmers, so we're not ploughing, and we're very much embracing the preservation of soil and producing grass-based beef as well. I'm a co-founder of Ladies in Beef, and I'm also part of a new initiative called the Suckler Beef Producers Association. And the Suckler beef sector is the largest supplier of prime beef in the UK, and it is one of the most vulnerable sectors that's going to be hit by these trade deals. Thank you.
Lovely, great to have you with us. Thank you very much. And finally, Philip.
Thank you very much. And again, thank you very much for inviting me to take part this morning. My name is Phil Stocker, and I'm the Chief Executive of the National Sheep Association. We're a membership organisation for sheep farmers across the UK. I'm a farmer by trade and by training, and I'm still a small-scale sheep keeper now. But most of my time is spent leading the work of the National Sheep Association. I'm also a director of a company called British Heritage Sheep, which is trying to build on the uniqueness of the heritage, the breeds, and the landscapes behind much of our sheep farming here in the UK as well. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much. Thanks to all of our witnesses. Okay, so I shall ask the first couple of questions just to kick us off and to get us underway. Questions really are probably for Dmitry and Séan in the first instance. But I just wondered if you could summarise what we know about the Australia deal so far, and also when you're telling us that, could you also tell us when are we likely to know more? What is still left to be agreed, and what are the negotiators kind of doing right now? So if I can come to Dmitry first with that, please.
Oh, thank you, Caroline. I'll try to be as brief as I can, which won't be hard because we don't know that much. What we have so far is an agreement in principle. This is something negotiators use when there are high-level political disagreements about what should be in a free trade agreement. And there's a big summit or event coming up where there is a chance to potentially resolve them without having the details done first. So what we know is that the two sides have committed to eliminating tariffs on everything except long grain rice, that they have agreed to effectively do it virtually immediately upon entry into force. The UK has said that it will phase out some of its tariffs, but from the numbers we've seen, they plan to do so so quickly, it's effectively an elimination of tariffs right from the start. We've heard that in exchange, Australia will eliminate its own tariffs, of which it doesn't have many, but it will get rid of the ones that it does have. And so far, we've had little tidbits of what else is in the deal, such as some improved processes and recognition for certain types of UK professionals, and making it slightly, expanding and making it slightly easier for young people from the United Kingdom to work in Australia for a few years without having to, for example, work on a rural property, as was the case before in your second year. So those are the details we have. What negotiators are doing at the moment is basically taking that high-level landing zone agreed by the ministers, who have said this is where we want to land, and negotiating both how to capture that in legal text in a way that works for both sides, and kind of filling in all of the gaps everywhere else on all of the issues that don't quite rise to that level of political, do A or do B. It's a big agreement and covers lots of things. So they're kind of filling in all of those other gaps through a series of negotiations.
Lovely. Thank you very much. And to you, Séan.
I don't think I can add very much by way of detail to what you've just been told. I'll just make two observations. One is it's really incorrect to look at what this deal might mean in the next year or two. Nothing really. No one can gear up to export that quickly. It takes time to breed animals and prepare other things. What one should really be doing is asking, where will we be in 10, 15 years' time? And my second point is, of course, there will be no trade deal unless, of course, access is given to a country like Australia on agricultural matters, because it's so important to that country. So what I think I can say without fear of contradiction is that whatever details are hammered out in the next few months, all other factors remaining equal, there will be much greater imports of beef and sheep from Australia in about 10 years' time, if not before.
Thanks so much. That's really helpful. And actually that leads very neatly into my second question, which I was going to put to Phil in the first instance, and then to Jilly, which is, what is the expected impact of increased Australian food imports on UK farmers?
So, thank you, Caroline. I think the expected impact is depression of prices. Really, is more pressure on prices. We know that Australia are highly efficient. They're the largest global exporter of sheep meat, and it's an area they specialise in. They will compete on price. They won't compete on quality or environmental standards or animal welfare standards. They will compete on price, and we know that any increased volume of a product coming onto our market that puts downward pressure on prices will affect the entire market over time. I think Sean's absolutely right that this isn't necessarily something that's going to affect us this year or next year, but in 10 years' time, I think we can expect much bigger volumes coming in. And I'd also say that this is really concerning because it is likely to happen at a time when the basic payment is being taken away from farmers. And one of the strategies of farmers in terms of being more productive is about raising their income, their return from the products that they sell. So price pressure at a time when we're going through that transition and that change in volatility is really unhelpful.
Thank you. And I can come to Jilly next.
Okay, I just think this is an absolute betrayal. And our prized food market, and in a particular sector as well, which is the food service and the hospitality, where most of this tonnage will come in, as well as some ready meals, and retail probably will be nervous about taking it. This is like Christmas all over for Australia, and then stacking up behind are the other big exporters. So Australia is the second largest in the world, and following behind will be New Zealand, as we know, and negotiations already started, Brazil and the States. And currently there's about 3,700 tons of Australian product coming into this country. And the agreement is 8 times that. So as soon as this is signed, and Sean is right, it'll take time to gear up. But we know that actually Australia has this capacity to do that, and that they're improving and making investment in their packing houses. But then you'll increase to 45 times that amount, to 170,000 in 15 years' time. The current amount of imported product is about 240,000, which is, we are only 65% self-sufficient. But it will have an impact, without doubt, and it'll have an impact. And now I'll come on to carcass balance, because it is about these prime cuts. 75% of product that comes from Australia is frozen, 25% is fresh. And it either is bone in, so it actually has the bone as part of that carcass in those cuts, or it's taken out. And it's those cut quotas that actually are so critical, as well as seasonality about when they come into the market, into our market, that really need to be thought through carefully. And I just don't get the feeling that there has been much collaboration, communication, discussion. What are the impacts? Has there been an impact assessment? I don't think so. And then we come on to the standards. And I know that this will probably be discussed in more depth, but actually the way we produce our grass-based beef here is incomparable to actually the scale of Australia. You know, you take the scale, it's brutal climate. There are breeds, Bos Indicus breeds in the tropical areas, and obviously the same Angus and Hereford and grass-based systems. They produce some fine quality animals, but we need to have the assurance of those animal welfare standards, the environmental standards, and the net zero, because we are very rapidly moving in this country to net zero by 2040. We will do that sooner on this farm because we're regenerative and carbon sequestration. But you have to have like for like equivalence, I think, in farm assurance. And as we know with red tractor standards, we have some of the highest levels of animal welfare and consumer protection as well, because that's audited all the way through from the field right the way to the fork.
Thank you.
Country of origin as well. So just to give you a flavour of how that might work.
Thank you very much. I was just going to hand over to Paul Blomfield, because in fact you've just begun to get into the issues that he's going to be asking about. So if you've got more to say, I'm sure you can in response to Paul's question. But let me pass the floor to you, Paul.
Okay, thanks very much, Caroline. And indeed, I do want to follow up on that issue, because in a sense, the question of standards that Jilly's touched on is at the heart of a lot of this discussion. And I wonder if she and also Phil could say a little bit more about how UK food regulations compare with those of Australia in relation to food safety, animal welfare, and, as Jilly's touched on, climate change. Because I've heard some of the concerns be brushed aside by spokespeople for the Australian farming industry. So your perspective would be very valuable. Perhaps Phil, perhaps Jilly, if you could start, and then I could bring Phil in.
Okay, well, I can only really speak probably from my, from farm assurance and red tractor assurance. And this is, it's a farmer and industry owned assurance scheme. And it's really important because it gives, it's an independent inspection that takes place on our farm every year on both arable and our grass beef enterprise. And it's really detailed. I mean, the record keeping, but it also, you have to demonstrate, in practice. So it goes right down to kind of antibiotic use, which in a suckler beef system is pretty much minimal or zero. And antibiotic use, as you know, is a big issue globally, as indeed hormone beef as well. And just on that subject, hormone beef, Australia has 40% production in hormone beef. And so they insert a pellet under the ear in that animal, and that accelerates growth by anything up to 30%. And clearly in this trade deal and in current European EU law, hormone beef is not accepted into this country. We'll probably come on to this a bit later on. In our system, just in terms of scale and size and our inspection, and I think this is quite important, Australia has 8 out of 10 of the largest ranches, cattle ranches in the world. And indeed, the biggest cattle ranch is 5.6 million acres. Sorry, acres, that's right, 5.6 million acres. Our farm is 600 acres. So you can see the enormity of the scale. And we're working in systems that actually really, by virtue of the way in which they're grazed, mob grazed, paddock grazed, moving to fresh grass every day, and the minimal use of the antibiotics, is part of the very fabric of beef production. We're a cottage industry in comparison to Australia. In terms of standards, if you just take transport, our cattle go 30 miles down the road and are slaughtered within 2 hours of leaving this farm. Cattle in Australia can travel up to 24 hours without food and water. That is legitimate. In live exports, and as we know, with new animal welfare standards have just been out to consultation, we're going to see a cessation of live exports. But live exports in Australia can be anything up to 48 hours without food and water. I think these are just baselines. They give an indication of baselines on how you approach the treatment of animals on their way to slaughter. They have to do it because of the scale and size of their country. That's inevitable, that's a practical consideration. But we're likely to see transport times reduced to about 8 hours in terms of distance to abattoirs for animal welfare benefits. There's been discussion about temperature, when should animals be transported? Again, with climate change, over a certain 30 degrees centigrade, that there should be restrictions on that. So it's all moving to actually, and this brings cost into our production system. We don't brand in this country. That is standard practice in Australia. So see, I'm not denigrating what they do, but that is been their system and will probably continue to be, I think. And unless I think that this is transparent, and that's really the issue, I don't think the Department of International Trade and DEFRA have been transparent about this animal welfare standards and environmental practice as well, because there are pesticides which are banned in the EU and this country, which are still in use in Australia. So you can see the complexity of this. And then when you get to the slaughterhouse, cameras are mandatory in this country. Cameras in slaughterhouses are mandatory. Quite right. I like that assurance to know that when the animals leave our farm, they are treated with dignity, respect, and the highest level of animal welfare. Unless they're, and you don't have a mandatory system in all abattoirs in Australia. I think that has to be a consideration, and it's really, really monitored by the abattoirs as well themselves.
Okay, thanks very much, Jilly. I wonder if I could bring Phil in to talk about the perspective for sheep farmers and the alignment of regulations between the UK and Australia in your sector.
Yeah. Thanks, Paul. Before I go into any detail, I would say within our industry there is a real serious feeling of betrayal here, because we've received promise after promise that our higher welfare and environmental standards will be protected, and anything coming in to be sold into our market would have to meet our standards, and it does seem at the moment that there's a complete rollback on those promises, and the whole approach, similar to what Jill has just outlined, the whole approach to the difference between sheep farming here in the UK and sheep farming in Australia is very, very different. And of course, there's variations in the way that some individual producers produce sheep here in the UK, as there is in Australia. But if you look at the baseline regulations and standards that are required, the differences are really significant. And I guess they start with the size and scale, and what follows from that is the attention and the attendance that shepherds and farmers give to their sheep. Our average flock size would be somewhere in the region of 300. In Australia, it would be thousands of breeding sheep, and with many going up to well over tens of thousands of breeding sheep. And you know, if you looked at the differences at lambing time in particular, you know, the attention that our sheep get in terms of you know, just care and attention when they're lambing, and avoidance of losses, and making sure that mothering is effective. It would be, you know, you'd go into a lot of sheep farms here in the UK, and it would look like an intensive care unit in a hospital. You know, it really is that sort of level. You know, in Australia, it's very much leave them to get on with themselves, and if they die, they die. They just get on with it, really. If you look at some of the individual standards, Jilly mentioned about livestock transport, and you'd be aware that the government at the moment are going through a consultation. We don't know what the outcome of that consultation is at the moment, but you can see where the direction of travel is in terms of reducing transport times. At the moment, our standards, I think, allow for total journeys of up to 28 hours, but that's with a break in between, a break in unloading and feed and water. Our understanding is the maximum journey time for sheep in Australia is 48 hours with no unloading, no rest and water. There's a discussion going on in the UK about whether there should be a restriction in terms of transporting animals at time of loading beneath less colder than -3 degrees centigrade or hotter than 25 degrees centigrade. That will impose some real restrictions on what we can do here in the UK, all in the aim of trying to improve animal welfare. You know, the heat in Australia means that they couldn't comply with those sorts of restrictions, and that takes you to another question, really, about whether the differences in terms of equivalence of standards and equivalence of values, because I think a lot of our standards here in the UK are driven by the values of what our public and our consumers expect. And to my mind, you know, if our consumers and our public don't want to see animals being transported long distances, I can't imagine why there would be any difference in their views about whether that transport is here in the UK or whether it's in Australia. On farm, there'd be loads and loads of differences. Probably the most recognised one is the practice of mulesing, which is a method of fly control, largely taken and practiced on merino sheep, where they take strips of the skin off of the back, the hindquarters of sheep. Again, many Australian farmers would say that's in the interest of welfare, to avoid fly strike and maggots, but it's a practice that you know, we would not even consider doing here in the UK. It's done without anaesthetic as well. Again, our consumers here would be absolutely horrified, I think, if they knew that we were buying or consuming products that from lambs that had been mulesed. We understand somewhere in the region of 60% of sheep would be mulesed in Australia. So there's a really serious welfare difference there. The environmental.
I wonder if I can just interrupt, because I'm conscious of time and all the other questions we've got. Could I just ask? And I read about the practice. I mean, the stuff that we've learned through this process is shocking. But specifically, I wonder if I could ask you both, just very briefly, have any estimates been made of the additional costs that UK farmers are going to face as a result of the deal?
Yeah, if I can come in there have been some assessments. From my knowledge, the cost of production of sheep, of lamb here in the UK would probably range from somewhere in the region of £55 a lamb through to around about £80 a lamb. There's quite a wide variation. In Australia, it would probably range from something like £40 to £50 a lamb. So there's a real difference in cost of production, and most of those additional costs on British producers would be brought about because of the extra or the additional requirements that are brought on them through environmental regulations and requirements, through animal welfare standards and regulations, but also through the general scale and size of the industry. And you know, the fact that our countryside is still really, really rich in terms of landscapes and our hedgerows and small field size, you know, all of those things bring an additional cost. And they do equate to a difference in cost in terms of the end product, and it's why Australia would be able to put products into our market and undercut the value or the cost of our products on the shelves.
Okay, many thanks. I'm conscious we might have a little bit more time because of the sequencing of questions. Jilly, have you got any brief comment on the additional costs you might face as a result of the deal? And then I wonder if I could bring David in briefly on that same question.
I just want to talk about our cost of production currently in comparison to Australia. And I've talked about the scale, and you're talking about farms of which will have 44,000 cattle, and we have a total of 250. So you can see on our acres how that figures. And obviously, because we don't have scale, our cost of production is inevitably higher. But already with animal welfare and environmental, and looking on this farm already to do, a large amount of carbon sequestration and assess that, we are about £2 per kilo more than the average Australian cost per kilo. So that is substantial. That's almost another 50% effectively. So we have to look for premiums in our marketplace to enable us to have a margin. And it's a sector, the suckler sector, which is, the suckling cow and calf, the traditional heritage system of production, which is grass-based. It's on grazing on generally what would be land that can't be cropped. So mountains, moorland, river meadows, marshes, pasture-based. Is not an intensive system, nor is it industrialized. And I think that's really what we have to think about. We are not feedlot systems here in the UK. It's part of a landscape management. And we haven't talked about the landscape and countryside and hedgerows and trees and soils yet, but I hope we have a chance to do that, because I think it's really important. I think those are key things that matter to consumers. They clearly matter in terms of policy of this government. That's why these promises that we've had from the Prime Minister down to, secretaries of states, that we will not compromise our standards, environmental or animal welfare. And that just seems to be being sold down the river.
Okay, many thanks, Jilly. Caroline, have I got time just to bring David in on this question? I'm conscious that...
I think we should very briefly, if that's all right, David. That would be great.
Yeah, so Jilly's covered a lot of the animal welfare differences between Australia and the UK. The RSPCA has designated 6 animal welfare differences in the beef sector and a couple in the sheep sector, and Phil has also talked about some of those. Now, as far as I'm aware, nobody has done any economic comparative analysis between UK and Australia based on animal welfare standards, but there are some pretty good economic studies that have been done on the difference between standards in the pig industry, in the laying hen industry, and in the chicken industry. Indeed, the European Commission produced endless economic studies when they, as you probably remember, Caroline, they agreed in 1999 to phase out the conventional battery hen cage system. So there were a lot of analysis done there. I think when you get into beef and lamb, which we're really talking about here with Australia, rather than say chicken, laying hens or pigs, the economic studies are much poorer and haven't been done, and it is quite tricky to tease out what are the animal welfare differences versus the different farming practices that have been mentioned.
Well, thanks very much indeed for that, David. I'll hand back to Caroline now.
Thanks so much, Paul, and I'm going to bring in Stephen Farry for the next question.
Thanks so much, Caroline. Good morning to all of our witnesses. I was essentially going to ask around sort of the reasons for the differences in production costs between the UK and Australia, but I think most of the questions have blended into one, so those have been covered to a large extent. I am happy to just give Jilly a bit of space, first of all, to pick up the point you're speaking about hedgerows, because I think one aspect perhaps which particularly both Jilly and Phil could maybe elaborate a little bit more around is the importance of land management and the management of the countryside, and how that is an integral part of the UK, and how that may well be impacted by these by the Australia deal. And also maybe just to play a slight devil's advocate, just to stress, I don't personally believe this, but I think it's worth just asking the question. For someone saying, I mean, someone could say, what is the harm in the Australia deal if we have a more competitive farming sector? Global competition is good. How do you push back against that type of argument? And indeed, I suppose, I mean, any of the other witnesses could come in on that point as well. So Jilly, over to you first to pick up on the hedgerow point first, then Phil and yourself on the wider issue.
Okay, so I'm fairly passionate about hedgerows and trees. We're looking in the next couple of years to actually be planting trees for shelter, for food, for cattle. Silvo pasture is the name, and it will also form part of the new environmental land management schemes as well. So these are really important, not just for carbon sequestration, but also for biodiversity. You know, these are habitats, and the non-cutting of hedgerows enables, you know, species to flourish, and that's food. That's food for wildlife. It's food for pollinators, and it also extends to herbal lays in pastures as well. Again, you know, we've been doing on our farm regenerative farming now for nearly 6 years, not ploughing. And we've also been taking this regenerative process through on our grazing meadows as well. So stitching in herbs and grasses, it's about pollination. But what I want to say is it can so quickly reverse species depletion. In a very short space of time, 2 years, you can see species recovery because there is just this cycle going round. And the management of cattle, so our mob grazed cattle and paddock grazing, cell grazing, so they're electrified fences, is really good for pasture management because cattle go on into about an acre paddock in our size. They eat that grass. Effectively, they eat a third, leave a third, and trample a third. And that goes into the soil, and you let the grass go to knee high so it seeds, and then they move on, and the dung is left on that paddock. The cattle move on to fresh grass, and it's replicating the great bison movements and also the gazelles and the great roaming herds in South Africa as well. So the bison's in the Midwest, but it's really good for soil, so worms and fungi, your hedgerow management. It's a management system, and that's why suckler beef cattle are so important to this. And the other point is you know, our systems are expensive because we have to house our cattle in winter. We can't leave our herd out on the river meadows because of flooding. Australia don't have those considerations. So in our infrastructure of our businesses, we're rewilding parts of our farm. So we're actually allowing gorse and scrub to come through because it gives early pollination to bees and others, bird species, stone chats, whitethroats. I mean, public goods, public money. I truly embrace the elms. We don't have enough detail, but the phasing out of BPS is dramatic and brutal. We should have no illusion about that.
Sure. Great. And maybe Philip and then maybe Sean, if you want to pick up on the sort of the devil's advocate point, what's the harm in global competition? Why does this matter?
Okay, thanks, Stephen. I'll try and keep this really short as well, but I think there's a real danger here, actually. And in a way, it boils down to this whole debate about land sharing or land sparing. And I think here in the UK, we've got a long history, particularly in the sheep and the grazed cattle sectors, a long history of land sharing where we farm within an environment where we're also going out of our way to try and provide environmental goods and wildlife habitats and that sort of thing. And the implications of something like this Australia deal, in my mind, will be that you know, farmers, the wide diversity of farmers, some will look more towards environmental protection and to tap into elms, and their productivity or their production will probably be less important to them. But there's absolutely no shortage of farmers in this country who were born, bred, trained to farm. They're on this earth, on this planet, to produce food. And if they end up being in a competitive situation with Australia, they will have no option but to, in a way, follow the approaches of that sort of agriculture. It will be more about stripping costs out. It'll be about increasing flock sizes, reducing staff, stripping any fixed costs out of the system. It'll be to the detriment of landscape and hedgerows. You know, they won't be interested in small fields. And with the way that prices are at the moment in the marketplace, I would say that there's a real danger that it can happen anyway. You know, if we don't get this balance right of good environmental incentives and rewards, there's no shortage of farmers out there just at the moment who would think that their future is going to be around production, productivity, producing products and selling them into the marketplace. And if we see pressure on prices through that marketplace, through the Australian deal, it will only drive those farmers into one way, and we'll end up with a conflict between productivity and the environment. And I think that is not what our public want, and I don't think is probably what our government wants, although I don't think they quite understand where we might be heading here.
Sure. Thanks, Phil. And maybe Séan, just...
well, let's be clear. Competition is good. And there are many people in this country who are unemployed on low incomes, 0-hour contracts, who, of course, don't want to pay more for their food than they really need to. I have great sympathy with Jilly and other farmers who, farm to very high standards. But let us be absolutely clear. If you're going to insist on identical standards, there'll be no trade agreements. And I'll leave it to others to judge whether that is really politically possible. Equivalence is another matter. And some of the issues that have been spoken about, such as long journeys with animals, can quite easily be solved without any major impact on Australia's ability to export. Incidentally, they won't be exporting live animals to us. It will be carcasses. So my point is really this. There's no point in complaining about scale, etc., unless you're going to argue that leads to lower welfare. This is precisely the sort of differences that lead to benefits from trade. You never really have identical standards. We never insist on identical pay and employment conditions for people that we are trading with. And the World Trade Organization is only too well aware of the temptation for people to invoke standards as really disguised protectionism. My point to really the agricultural industry in this country is that unless they actually believe the government is not going to proceed with free trade agreements with the countries, and all the ones they've lined up really now are big agricultural exporters, unless they believe that they're going to manage to stop that, they should be turning around the other way and saying, how on earth are we as an industry going to cope with the increased imports? I'm afraid I've come to the conclusion you're not going to stop them. The government isn't going to stand on it. I know it stands on its head on many things, but not on this. And therefore, you can appeal all you like, but you're taking your mind away from what you really need to be doing to prepare for the threat.
Chair, could I just check, am I okay for time, or am I at my limit?
You've got about a minute.
Okay, Séan, just very quickly, just to maybe slightly push back against that. Obviously, there's a lot of potential deals with countries that are very much primary producers in areas like agriculture. But the UK is also doing deals with countries like Japan and perhaps other societies where there's a very strong protectionist approach towards agriculture, and they're more interested in manufactured goods and services. So this is not a uniform sort of situation facing the government.
The deals with Japan, etc., were just largely, there's a slight change on cheeses, rolled over from the EU agreement. If the UK wants to strike out on its own as a relatively weak economic country, it wants to strike out on its own for free trade deals with the likes of, Australia, New Zealand, America, Brazil, etc., it is going to have to give ground on imports of agricultural products. Otherwise, there'll be no deal. And goodness me, the Americans have made that so clear over the recent years. You cannot accuse the Americans of hiding behind, any dissembling or whatever. They made it abundantly clear. We will adopt their standards or there'll be no deal. Now, I leave you to judge where the government will jump when push comes to shove.
That's okay. Thank you, Séan. Back to you, Chair.
Thanks very much, Stephen. I know we could have taken that conversation a lot longer were we to have had the time, but let me pass over now, please, to Leila Moran.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you all. It's absolutely fascinating session so far. And my question is really, from the point of view of the consumer, what are they going to see? Perhaps immediately, will we notice a difference in prices? Over 5 years, will we notice a difference in prices? What can the consumer expect out of this? Perhaps I can ask Jilly first.
Thank you. Can we just talk about the deal itself? Because actually, in terms of consumers seeing a benefit, I think it's been worked out, and the, you know, Australia is largely tariff-free in terms of products. So I think the beneficiaries of this deal are, in terms of export market, are Mr. Kipling cakes, which apparently go down very well there, jams and pickles, and obviously some cars, which is actually really, I understand, pretty critical to this country. And if it opens up opportunity for electric cars in the north of England and those supply chains, that's great. And that all contributes to actually helping climate change. But in terms of the deal to the consumer, the Australian product is going into the food service sector, and also some elements of cuts will go into ready meals and convenience food like sandwiches and such like. So, you know, some roast cuts will go into that market. But it's worked out roughly as being about £1 per person, or £1.20, I think is to be accurate. £1.20 per person per year is the cost saving. So it's negligible, but so much has been given away. And I think if you then want to
is that a projection?
I think what the deal at the moment is at the agreement of principle, but right. Dmitry could comment on that. But that's what has been quoted effectively. I think that's what's actually upset us so much. So much being given away for so little benefit to the consumer. But actually, if we think about this big increase in tonnage is going to go into what we call food service, but it's essentially the restaurants, the hospitality sector, and chains. And you'll see from COVID that, you know, we had a real problem last March and April where the eating out market, the eating out of home is effectively what it is, was completely shut down. So where are all these stakes going to go? And you know, it's the prime cuts. And one thing that we haven't spoken about why the impacts are so much more on the British beef industry, and particularly the Suckler sector, is the primal cuts. So the sirloins, the fillets, and the rump steaks actually command a much higher price per kilo in the whole carcass of that animal. So there's a huge amount of mince, and 50% of beef sales are mince, stewing steak, and then obviously the roast, the hindquarters. But those primal cuts go into the hospitality sector, and they had no home for them. So where did they go? And this was something that was really good, I think. The British government, DEFRA, the retailers, the abattoirs processors, HDB and Quality Meat Scotland and Welsh Beef all worked together in order to drive demand within the retail sector. So people have been enjoying eating high quality steaks, pretty affordable prices, and that volume supply has been able to be absorbed. And actually beef eating is up, beef sales are up. Consumers have discovered scratch cooking, working from home. They've learned much more about their high street butcher, their farm shops. I mean, it's been really brilliant, the support we've had from the public and the retailers. I think it's only 2 retailers are now not 100% British. But when you go to the food service sector, menu transparency and honest labelling is a different matter altogether. There are country of origin rules for retail and red tractor. Catering butchers also have rules of origin, but when it comes into the hospitality sector and food service, then you get into this grey, non-consumer communication on the source. Now we have managed to achieve 65% of our UK food service market share. And as Ladies in Beef, and I also, you know, co-founded Great British Beef Week, we've seen that growing and growing. Australia send high quality cuts, but if they can very easily undermine our market. Mm-hmm. And therein lies the challenge, because the red tractor assurance is very strong in the retail sector, but it is less so in the food service sector. And then you can
they'll undermine it by, just so I'm clear, so they'll undermine it by selling cheaper prime cuts of beef to the catering sector, and therefore there'll be less market for the British beef sector to buy into. Is that just so I've understood that correctly?
But if we would just take the quota, so if we were to have 7,000 tons just of sirloin strips So just sirloin. So if that was sirloin, 7,000 tons of sirloin coming in, and coming in particularly at the wrong time. So there are premiums in the market, the annual market, Christmas, there are premiums, and we try and finish our cattle for the summer months when there's, when there's less British supply. That's 20% of our market. If they were to send 35,000 tons, and I will say that is unlikely, of sirloin, that would be 100% of our UK requirement. Now, Séan is right, but for 10 years on, but there are things that happen in the interim. So trade wars between China and Australia. China only takes hormone-free beef. And if trade is a way of actually creating power battles and influencing outcomes. If China, some of that is excludes Australian product, where will they go? They'll go to a very highly prized market where they will get top dollar for their product, and it fits with the cuts that they can send over, particularly what you call the boned out cuts, the primal cuts. That will really substantially undercut us, and it will depress farm gate prices. And because of the UK, that carcass balance, I hope you understand what I've said about that. It's the primal cuts are the highly prized primal cuts.
Yes. So what you're saying here is that, I'm just trying to completely understand, and I see the impact on the sector and the market, but the consumer can potentially therefore see cheaper meals in restaurants. Is that what we're likely to see?
No,
I'm trying to understand what, as you say, there's no benefit to consumers more than £1.20 over the course of the year. So if all this extra product is coming in and going into the catering industry, where is that? What's that going to do to the market? Is the consumer going to see nothing, and it's the catering industry that's going to reap the profits? Where is that money going to go?
I think only if Australia were forced to send it here because they haven't got more lucrative markets in Asia, China, or the Middle East. They're coming to this market because they can get high premium prices. They're shipping it 10,000 miles. It'll be on a boat for 60 days. And I can't see chefs and that restaurant or even the chains wanting to reduce their meal price, because steak is often the choice of eating out market because it's more expensive than mince and stewing steak. So it's a special occasion. It's going out. I'm going to have a steak, and it will be a guest steak on a lot of menus, it probably won't have Australian put against it. I don't think so. But whereas you'll probably find that maybe there is Scotch beef or West Country beef or West Country lamb. And where they want differentiation on their menus, generally, chefs. I do not think they will price discount unless they're doing special promotions, for example. So they might do that. They might have the pub promotion, 2 steaks, for the price of 1. Well, that will be imported product without a doubt. The area that we have to be mindful of is ready meals. So ready meals, and if you take the sandwich market, there are some premium retailers that will use Australian topside in their sandwiches, roast beef sandwich. You don't have to have country of origin on ready meals, nor this convenience market either. You do on retail and you do on catering butchers. So you can see that there is the ability to kind of bring it in quite, really weaken the market if there isn't any what you call carcass weight equivalents on those fresh boned out cuts.
Okay, thank you. If I might just ask Dmitry. So Dmitry, this and forgive me if it's not you, Dmitry, and someone else has the answer, but this £1.20 per person per year, is pretty paltry, especially given what we seem to be giving up for it. How was that calculated? And is that, do we think, a pessimistic estimate, or because I still don't totally understand. If this product is coming in from Australia, they're seeking from their end to make a profit. Why would people here buy it if it's not as good a standard, it's coming from far away, unless it was to increase their profit margins or to reduce price so they can increase volumes? And therefore, if all of that is true, then how is it that it's only £1.20 that the consumer is going to get the benefit from this over the course of the year? Please explain that to me.
Yeah, sure. So if I understand the number you're referencing correctly, I think all someone did was take the aggregate GDP impact per year over the long term of this deal, which was calculated via just basically macro analysis, and then divided it by the population of the United Kingdom. So, they just divided one figure by 64 million, and that's how they got that number. It is a number designed to grab headlines and generate retweets. I would not treat it with a great deal of seriousness.
Right.
In terms of the benefit to the consumers, I think it's really important to understand what it is we're talking about here. So the free trade agreement removes a barrier to trade, and that barrier is the ability of the UK government, at which it's currently utilizing, to levy tariffs on that trade. Those tariffs are prohibitive. So it eliminates a government barrier to trade. It does not change any of the other market realities. I was looking at the numbers while some of the other speakers were speaking. In June of this year, Europe accounted for 1% of the Australian export market in red meat. Asia is about 70%. The North America is about 39%. So it's just a snapshot. It's not a representative figure. They can sell more, but for Australia specifically, it's not a high figure. That won't change overnight, but the government will lose the ability to impose tariffs to prevent it. In terms of what happens next, it's really one of three things, and there are a lot of factors that determine it. Either there is generally significantly more Australian red meat on the UK market, which depresses prices. If it meaningfully depresses prices, that means Jilly and a lot of her colleagues are going to be hurt. There's simply no way around that. If the prices for what you produce are dropping, you are hurt. I think everything Sean said 100% applies. I have no disagreement at all. The second, the kind of flip side option is that the tariffs were never the problem, and Australia's most lucrative markets remain in Asia and North America and the Middle East. Australia has some supply side constraints. It can't simply double the amount of cows it produces next week or even in 5 years. So things stay roughly as they are, in which case the consumer benefits are next to zero. Australia doesn't send significantly more lamb. Maybe it displaces some French beef, but consumers probably won't notice a difference. The most likely outcome is something a little bit in the middle, where there is an increase in how much beef and lamb Australia sends. Consumers probably won't feel it too much at the restaurant table or in the supermarket. But for UK restaurateurs, they will have more options. For UK producers of prepackaged goods, they will have more options. They will be able to, they will yield slightly higher profit margins. Perhaps some of that will be passed on to the consumer. The fact is, I think people tend to compare the impact of a free trade agreement to GDP, which is all economic activity in the country. It's important to have some perspective. This is effectively some tax cuts on a small subsection of trade with a distant country. It's comparing it to all economic activities a little extreme. So will consumers, to get back to your question, will consumers massively benefit from this? It's genuinely hard to see how. Will there be some marginal benefits? Yes. Will some restaurateurs benefit? Yes. Will there be a little bit more variety? Perhaps. And the impact on farmers will really depend on how much take-up there is from Australia. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much. That was very comprehensive. I see Phil's dying to come in, but I'm also very aware of time. So Phil, and then
30 seconds.
She'll allow.
Okay,
yes.
I'll try and keep this really short, but I just wanted to pick up on the issue of carcass balance. And Jilly mentioned this, but it's absolutely critical. The Australian trade historically and will continue, I think, has largely come into our catering supply chains, the public procurement markets, the ready meals, and the catering chain. And when those products come in, we all know when we go out for a meal that it's a steak or it's a lamb shank or something. It's one product. They don't have to deal with carcass balance. And if you think about our supply chains here in the UK, the smaller we go, if we think about the high street butcher and the farm shop, they deal with whole carcasses, and it's like a skill of the butcher to create products to make use of the whole carcass. When you get a shipload, and it comes through to the tonnage, the TRQ volumes that we're talking about, when you get a whole container load of boned legs or something like that, we don't have to deal then with the rest of that carcass balance. It disrupts the market hugely, and that's why we need to start talking about controls around or coefficients around carcass weight equivalents on these tonnages, so that we can take account of that carcass balance and bone in or bone out product. I'll leave that there. It's a really important issue.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. That's something I had not thought about, but a really, really good point. Thank you so much. I am a bit worried about time, so if we can try and keep the questions and answers as crisp as possible, and I will come to Hilary Benn as the example of doing that.
Well, Caroline, thank you very much indeed. We spent a lot of time this morning so far discussing what Australia has got out of this deal, in particular in relation to agriculture. I want to turn to you, Dmitry, and ask this. Insofar as we know, what has the UK got out of this deal, and have we gained as much as we've given?
So we don't have a lot of information on what the UK has gained beyond what we know, which is that Australia is giving up its tariffs. They weren't high to begin with, but in some places like Scott's whiskey, there was sort of, I think, 5 to 8%, which isn't game changing, but it's not nothing. And there's been some additional information about, as I said at the start, visa regimes and recognition of professional qualifications. What we really don't know about are UK gains in areas where the UK has really strong, what we call offensive interests. So access to the Australian market in areas like investment, professional services, financial services. My understanding is that part is still being negotiated. From everything I've heard, that is still up in the air, as far as I know. But certainly, no one said anything.
Right. Now, those would be obvious offensive interests of the UK. Does Australia have defensive interests when it comes to granting that kind of services access?
Yeah, look, most countries are fairly defensive in services, just by virtue of the way international trade's worked out. Services considerably less liberalized than goods for a whole host of reasons. It touches on a lot of sensitive areas. It can involve billions of dollars in investments. It touches on areas like health, education, which are very politicized. And frankly, services has just never been as sexy and capable of convening meetings like this as agriculture and manufacturing. And I think that's a factor, and we'd be silly to ignore it. In practice, yes, Australia does have defensive interests. The UK is an absolute services powerhouse. The City of London alone, the concentration of lawyers, accountants, management consultants, artists, all of those things, the ability for them to sell directly to Australian consumers, especially when it comes to services involving doing business in Australia or interacting with Australian law, for example, would be a really serious defensive interest for Australia.
Right. But doesn't it weaken the UK's position to have announced there's going to be a deal when we're still trying to negotiate on the bits that you've just described are of particular interest to the UK in terms of the dynamics of a trade negotiation?
So what we don't know is what was the backroom understanding behind announcing that deal. And effectively, what was the price that Minister Truss and Prime Minister Johnson extracted from the Australians, but perhaps wasn't ready for prime time. So perhaps there is a very generous set of packages in terms of the UK's Australian offensive interests lurking just behind the curtain. But certainly when you concede to Australia that you will provide them full agricultural market access except rice, that is always Australia's #1 offensive interest. and you can't do much better than that. So now Australia has an incentive to get the deal done, but perhaps it is undermines the position somewhat. Yes.
Interesting. Now, Séan, what do you make of who's gained most?
Oh, well, of course, without knowing the details, that cannot be answered accurately. But I think what we can say without fear of contradiction is that the benefits, such as we are aware of them, are going to be spread very thinly and widely, and the costs are going to be concentrated very heavily on, in fact, a part or parts of one industry. Of course, we know there are always winners and losers when it comes to trade negotiations. It just seems that agriculture is going to bear a disproportionate cost of this deal. And what worries me is it's the template for the deals that will be done with others. So, you know, as I said at the beginning, next year or two, you won't see much difference. Everyone will start saying, well, what was all the fuss about? 15 years out, you'll have a potentially enormous impact on an agricultural industry. And I think the government are only too well aware of that. If you look carefully at their Agricultural Act, it's not about producing food now. It's about encouraging farmers to do something other than produce food. They are preparing to slim down the agricultural industry. And I think that is just such a waste of enormous opportunities, enormous potential here. So desperate are the government to do deals. They know they've got to give up a lot on agriculture, and they're really not asking what they can do to the food industry to offset that. So it's not a direct answer, I'm afraid, but I don't know the details of the other elements.
I mean, that's a very interesting take on it, given I'm certainly speaking personally, I would regard agriculture as a strategic industry. Dmitry, coming back to you, do you think there's any truth in the argument that says the government was so keen or even desperate to sign this deal because it's the first one that isn't a rollover of the arrangements we had already through our membership of the EU, that might have been the most important consideration rather than the precise terms of the deal? Do you think that's a fair assessment?
I never try to speculate on what's in people's hearts or what's motivating, but I will say that if I'm on a negotiating team, one thing we always look pretty careful at is for whom is failing to get a deal this month a bigger political blow at home. And I think it's hard to see, especially once the target of a signature by G7 was announced. I think the political costs for Boris Johnson in failing to meet that deadline were considerably higher than they were for Prime Minister Morrison and the Australians. And that's certainly an advantage in the room. I would also say that it is possible to interpret the approach the UK has taken here, which is effectively full liberalization, rather than a more granular approach where they protect some industries and not others, or they ease up pressure in a certain way, reflects a desire for haste. If they had attempted to more strategically protect certain sectors, it would have taken much longer and they would have blown through their deadlines. And it is possible to see a post hoc ergo propter hoc kind of there to read that into it.
Right. Now, Séan, I saw you nodding at regular intervals during Dmitry's answer. Do I take it that you agree with that assessment?
Yes, my view would be that the government is in a very weak position. It has held up the trade deals has been the so-called benefit of Brexit, and they know. In fact, it was in the ERG's papers tucked away, 4 years ago. Agriculture will be decimated. That's the words of, their so-called experts. They knew the costs of these free trade deals. The argument would be, I'm sure, from their side, that other sectors will gain at the cost of agriculture.
Well, I think we're waiting to see any other sectors getting. Very quickly and finally, Dmitry, do you know what Tony Abbott's role is in advising the Department of Trade?
No. I don't.
You don't? It's because it's quite unusual. Is it quite unusual in your experience to make an appointment like that?
Yes, though I will say it is also quite unusual to effectively build a trade department and trade negotiating capacity from scratch at a great urgency. So bringing in people like Prime Minister Abbott, or much more, I think, much more, shall I say, wisely, someone like Falcon Cofounder, the New Zealand former negotiator, makes a lot more sense in a way it wouldn't in, say, an Australian context where we've been doing this for a lot longer. Crawford Faulkner, God. Yeah.
Okay, that is really helpful. Thank you so much. Thank you, Caroline.
Thanks, Hilary. And I think Dmitry shown there why he became such a great diplomat in the quality of those answers. I was going to hand the floor now to Philippa Whitford.
Thanks very much, Caroline. If I could start with David. One of the public's concerns is very much about food standards. My concern as a medic is things like antimicrobial resistance, which the UK and the EU have prevented antibiotic use purely as a growth promoter, really for the last 15 years. Now, when we see the detail, there will be chapters there on, cooperation, on standards, etc. So I'm just going to run all my questions together and then come round who wants to ask. Do you think that content is likely to be meaningful? And what are the things the government could do or could have done? Could this dramatic reduction in tariffs have been put with that what was exported to the UK would have to meet UK standards? I mean, is that something we see in other trade deals? And the comment in Hillary's session about the precedent this sets for a US trade deal and others is obviously quite chilling.
Yeah, thanks for that. So, the one issue that we haven't discussed as to what the benefits are is what the UK has pushed forward, which is membership of CPTPP, and that scares the RSPCA, because with Australia we're just talking about essentially beef and lamb, but with CPTPP, particularly when you're looking at Canada, Mexico, we're talking about eggs, we're talking about chicken, we're talking about pork meat. And as we all know, the UK's animal welfare standards are well above any of those countries in those issues. Therefore, it's cheaper to produce, and therefore it's easier to export those products into us. So yesterday, I'm not sure if committee is aware, yesterday the EU Commission made a fantastic announcement. They said that they were going to get rid of cages for laying hens, for pigs and for other animals. But more importantly, they said two important things which are really vital for this discussion. Number one is that in any future FTAs, they will demand equivalence for their animal welfare standards. So they recognize that there is no point in raising their animal welfare standards and then just exporting those standards to other countries. The UK hasn't done that. Now, obviously, as others have said, we don't know the details in the agreement. But I think it is fairly certain, because the UK seems to be really embarrassed about mentioning what those details are, which is why they go on about the model animal welfare chapter. Well, that's great. That will have warm language on cooperation, on working together, on research, etc. That's brilliant. The RSPCA supports that, but it doesn't protect our farming industry. They've talked about non-regression clauses. That's great. But that's essentially making sure that we don't lower our animal welfare standards, or Australia doesn't lower their animal welfare standards. As far as I'm aware, the UK has never lowered our animal welfare standards, and Australia really has no intention, because they're pretty low anyway. So why haven't they discussed, and why haven't they answered any of the questions that have been put to them, which is, what is the conditionality language in the FTA? And that is because I don't think there is any conditionality language in the FTA. Now, the EU, as I said yesterday, made this great announcement on equivalence in any future FTAs. They themselves are trying to negotiate a trade deal with Australia. And that is not really going anywhere. And probably with this announcement, Australia will go, well, we might as well give up and look elsewhere. But the EU has already shown the way on this. So with the Mercosur EU deal, they have agreed equivalence on eggs. So they have said to Mercosur, we'd like to get your egg products coming into the UK and to the EU, but only if they are produced to EU standards. So that is the first time we have seen in an FTA some equivalence language. And I think the UK had a real opportunity with Australia, and probably a greater opportunity with New Zealand, to put equivalence language and conditionality in there. And it's really interesting. We talked about why Australia has been first. So New Zealand last week and the UK finished their 5th round of negotiations. I think Australia was up to the 3rd round when suddenly they went into this trade sprint to make sure they were ready for the G7. New Zealand has pretty well equivalent standards to the UK. And probably they've got better they are the only country in the world that has better standards to the UK in some areas. Australia, we all knew, had far poorer standards. So why did the UK bend over backwards to Australia? And they haven't done the same to New Zealand, even though the New Zealand minister was over for G7 as well, so they could have signed something there. So I think the UK is being very, very coy. And I go back to what is in the government's manifesto. The government will not compromise on animal welfare standards in any free trade agreement. What does that mean? What does that mean? Does that mean that we won't lower them? Well, that's fine. We weren't going to lower them. But if you don't have conditionality or equivalence in your FTA, it means you export your animal welfare standards. And I think the government is being very coy, is probably a polite way of saying it. A more reasonable way of saying it would be disingenuous as to what they've done.
I mean, I think Jilly's point earlier as I came on, and I apologize for coming in late, I was in another meeting, that in essence, you know, the public are saying, oh, I'm not going to buy this, that, and the other. The public in many situations simply won't know, whether it's ready meals, takeaways, or schools or hospitals. You know, none of that food do you know the source of it. If I could maybe come to Séan next, and then Jilly or Phil, as you want to feed in on this issue of should we not have been associating the reduction of tariffs with a maintenance of welfare standards. And particularly, as I say, I have a concern around the antibiotics. I know we're tied up with COVID at the moment, but the next big health threat is antimicrobial resistance, which would simply end complex surgery if we run out of antibiotics that work. So over to you, Séan.
Well, just very briefly on this, I really come back to my point that I think the government is desperate to do deals, and that is why they're not going to push these details. But I think we also need to be a little careful. You know, we're going to get all this over chlorine washed chicken, etc. with America. You know, this is Australia will be able to adjust some of its production if it's directed at the UK. So if the UK really was to push down on this, I don't think it would make much difference. Actually, the Australians over the next years would prepare for that. Why don't we push down on it? Why don't we insist? Because frankly, we're weak, and these other countries can say, if you want a deal, it's going to be done on our terms. And America has said that. America said, we've got to wake up, etc. We accept their standards or whatever. You might just, if you were getting old and cynical like me, which of course you're not, you might think that this Australian deal is preparing people for when they really have to hit them with an American deal later on.
Thanks. Jilly or Phil, do you want to comment before I come to Dmitry?
I'm quite happy to come in just very quickly. I don't think I need to add much to what David and Séan have said. I agree with it fully, and we absolutely should connect standards around welfare and antibiotic use to tariff-free access to the UK as well. That was a promise that was made to the industry all the way through. Yeah. Month after month, the industry has been promised that our higher standards would be protected through these trade deals, and that we would be global leaders in pushing forward these the improvements in animal welfare, health, and environmental management. And you can see that what we're going to come down to is a discussion around some loose form of equivalence that will give people access to our markets without being, you know, entirely the same. And I think it's huge.
Falling at the first hurdle is literally flinging ourselves on the ground at the first hurdle.
Well, we've used the phrase previously that we've always been concerned that we're going to be the sacrificial lamb in these trade deals for the benefit of other economic benefits, and it certainly looks like that's the way it's heading.
I mean, there's a real concern in Scotland. Obviously, 85% of our land is very rough. It's very much an animal-based sheep and beef kind of industry in Scotland. We don't have the land to suddenly change to other forms of agriculture, and what we could see is just vast tracts of land going for sale cheaply because farms are not sustainable. Jilly, have you anything to add?
Yes, I do, and it is about farm assurances and also inspections and auditing, and this government evidencing the product that comes in is produced to equivalence standard. Now, I want to talk about farm assurance in Australia, and it's not the same as we have here, because in one farm assurance scheme, and they have got gold, silver, and bronze, but I just want to speak generically. They have in one category 4-year inspections. So the first year is an independent inspection, which we have annually. The second year is self-certification by the farmer. Okay, so bear in mind how big these cattle ranches are and feedlots. The third year is certification by the feed merchant or possibly the vet, so someone who is involved in the business. And then the fourth year is again a self-certification by the farmer. That is not the same. And going on to kind of ensuring that there are inspections by UK government on farm, in the supply chains, and also abattoirs and packing, and also transportation, whether it's animals to slaughter or transport on the boat. And then when it comes here to making sure that there is testing to make sure that no hormone beef is coming in, these are critical key factors. Now, the EU were really hot on this. I happened to be in Brazil and Argentina when at one of the plants there was an inspection, really hot. And as you know, there were some issues around really, really appalling organized crime in I think it was Brazil, in chicken and beef plants, where this is phytosanitary hygiene rules, and they shut it down. They acted quickly. If I'm really honest, I don't have any confidence that this government, they'll just do a box ticking exercise. They won't drill down into the detail. I don't think they'll inspect. And even worse still, I'm not sure that there will be testing of product when it comes into this country in sufficient, with regularity, sufficient regularity by the Food Standards Agency or the Animal Plant and Welfare, APHA, Animal Plant Welfare Group. APHA, it's the veterinary and plant inspection. And that's really important. That's consumer protection. That is critical. So that it has to be backed up by evidence. I've heard none of that. So there's a long way to go. And what's really sad, I think, is it's such a shame. There's so much knowledge and expertise in this country. The British Meat Process Association, the technical, they represent the processors of the abattoirs. Obviously, farmers, the RSPCA, there's Red Tractor, HDB, Quality Meat Scotland and Wales. There's so much knowledge here. The food service sector, they could have really tapped in to a lot of useful, open, transparent, factual, evidence-based information and facts that could have helped them.
I mean, that's going to be quite important if, I could imagine us being told, oh yes, there's farm assurance in Australia the same way as farm assurance here. And the public are not going to be aware of what you've just described, what that difference is. And as someone from Belfast originally, the more we have these issues, actually, the more the Northern Ireland issue will become problematic, because if the EU doesn't have a trade deal with Australia, then suddenly there really is a vested interest in a backdoor into the single market for things that aren't the standard that the EU wants. If I could come to you, Dmitry, very quickly, just if you've anything to add to what's been said.
Yeah, so look, I mean, trade is about choices. And I think I just keep coming back to Sean's point, which is that the UK produces produces agriculture in a certain way. And if it wants that method of farming to continue, if it wants the countryside to continue looking the way it does, Jilly's point about hedgerows, all of this other stuff, it really only has a select list of options. It can keep alternatives out through a combination of tariffs and ethical bans. It can encourage farmers to basically try to transition into more US, Australia style agricultural production, which doesn't sound like it's hugely viable. It can trust in consumers to just back farmers and pay higher prices for things that are labeled red tractor, but that approach has limits as well. Or it can massively roll out a subsidy regime within the constraints of international trade law to basically say, look, UK farming is uncompetitive with foreign imports on its own terms. We are going to step into the breach on this and try to keep them up. At the moment, what we know with this deal is that they have opted not to employ the tariff option, at least when it comes to Australian competition. And they've certainly set a precedent for other deals. Other negotiators are going to have a very hard time justifying to the US Congress, to Bolsonaro in Brazil, why they're coming home with less than what the Australians got, given the size of the Australian market, export market. So they've created that precedent. They're closing that door. The question is, okay, is the UK vision that farming, as Séan says, winds down? Or is what's plan B? Because simply telling British farmers, harden up, be more competitive, is perhaps, as so many of the people here have said, yes, Amflo, as so many people have said, it's not really an option for a whole bunch of reasons.
Thanks very much, Dmitry. The worry is that we see land prices just plummeting and people hoovering up what were farms, and heaven knows what they turn them into. Thanks very much. Back to you, Caroline.
Thanks so much, Philippa. Hand the floor now to Tamara.
Thank you, Chair. My question is, has the UK government or NFU produced a detailed impact assessment of the changes likely to result from the UK's trade deals? David, I'd like to come to you first, please.
So the answer to that is no, but there will be several impact assessments. So the Trade and Agriculture Commission, which, as you know, is out for tender at the moment. They've invited applications to that. Hopefully that will be up and running this month or maybe early next month. And they, under the Agriculture and the Trade Acts, they have to produce a report on an impact assessment on the agriculture implications of the Australia deal when it is laid before Parliament. And I assume this is going to be laid before Parliament in November, December, once they've agreed all the legal scrubbing and sorted out all the nuts and bolts that need to be sorted out. Because don't forget, this is still an agreement in principle. This is not a free trade agreement. Secondly, under the process, the Department of International Trade also have to do their own impact assessment. That is part of legislation. It is in the Trade Act, and the Secretary of State has agreed in Parliament that she will produce an impact assessment. When that gets produced, I don't know, but I would imagine that will come at the same time as the TAC report. So maybe not until October, November. So hopefully we will get some useful information from that, because at the moment, frankly, we don't really have any. The UK has one of the poorest ways of negotiating free trade agreements in terms of accountability and transparency. As you know, Parliament does not have a veto on an FTA. All they can do is endlessly postpone agreeing that FTA. So unlike other countries, and indeed, I think it's ironic that Australia seems to be moving to more transparency. I've got more information about the Australia deal than I did. I got more information from Australia than I did from the UK on this. And I think that says a lot about transparency and how the UK operates. But we will get some impact assessments.
My question, David, is what if the two impact assessments contradict one another from the two different teams?
Well, all I'd say is that the Independent Trade and Agriculture Commission will produce an independent report, and the Department of International Trade will produce a government report. And then it's up to MPs and politicians to look at those two reports in that context.
That's really helpful. Thank you. Thank you so much, David. And sorry, with Zoom, I'm sorry that I spoke over you. I do apologise for that, David. Séan, I want to ask you the same question, please.
Well, the truth of the matter is that you can cut an assessment so many ways. I'm sure if the government come forward and say, well, we're looking at the next 5 years, it won't look too damaging. You've really got to look further out. And we've got to also be mindful to what extent this is a template for other deals. Look, I think we can just go back to basics here. The amount of food consumption in the United Kingdom is growing at less than 1% a year. We're a well-fed population, and really the volume increases don't go up very much. If we start to import a large proportion of our food, one of two things must happen. Either prices will adjust down and farmers will leave the industry in this country, or we need to export our way out of this. At the end of the day, if more imports are coming in and we're not going to eat a lot more food, I'm afraid that is the iron law of economics. And we spend a lot of time talking about subsidies for farmers, and we've heard all this debate about phasing out direct payments, and the government are going to come forward with environmental payments. I insist that the trade effects are going to be bigger than those, and they are almost completely ignored because the government, or Mr. Gove in particular, very cleverly turned the NFU on its head and got them thinking and talking about environmental subsidies and missing what was happening to food production. At the end of the day, is agriculture an industry for producing the countryside, or is it an industry for producing the food? I insist it can be a modern food industry and deliver the countryside. We're giving that up. We're saying let's focus on the environment and leave others to import our food. And I really think that if you could get into the heart of government, and I suspect Hilary Benn knows this better than I, food security in this country for many years has been regarded as our ability to import food from other parts of the world. And I don't see that has changed one bit post-Brexit.
Thank you, Sean, because you draw on a sense of identity, which is core to what I think this conversation is really about. Are we a country that respects not only the land, but also the food that we create, and how we and what we eat, and the value that we put on our ecological biosystem? Philip, I just want to bring you in before I revert back to the chair on that question, and thank you very much for your answers.
Okay, thank you very much. And again, I don't think I've got a great deal to add, but I don't. Well, I know that those assessments haven't been done to date. We know that this deal has got to go in front of Parliament, and it will go in front of an independent trade and agriculture commission at some stage. The only thing I would say about it all is that we've just got some really unhelpful tendency to look at things in isolation, and we just don't join these things together. We look at climate policy, we look at animal welfare policy, we look at nature recovery policy, and if we're lucky, from time to time we look at food policy, although it's not that regular. And we have to find a way of connecting all of these things up and having a bigger strategy and a plan around the use of our land and what we want from our land. And my big fear for the future is that we're going to lose a lot of our food security, and a lot of our production that will be left in 10 or 15 years time will be more focused to trying to access premium wealthy markets anywhere across the globe, while we just bring products in to feed our nation. And I think that's hugely worrying, actually. And we just need to look at the whole thing as a whole, in terms of our food security, a land for agriculture, land for nature recovery, and the way that we go about climate change as well, and carbon storage.
Yeah, I think those are all really pertinent points. And I also, referring back to what's been told earlier, I didn't realise that when my son had school meal, of course, there's no traceability on where that food's come. So I've learned so much from this meeting, and thank you for all your insights. I now revert back to the chair. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Tamara. That's really, really helpful. Liz, let me come to you, Liz Roberts.
Thank you very much, Chair. What I'd like to ask Phil and Sean in the first instance is the particular impact on Welsh and Scottish agriculture, given our dependency on the sheep sector. If I could start, Phil, with you, please.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I guess the answer is that it's going to impact more on farmers in Wales and Scotland than it will in England, because agriculture is a much larger part of their economy. I haven't got the figures in front of me, but we know that a larger proportion of Wales's GDP than England is made up from agriculture and food, and anything that affects farming and food markets will impact on people in Wales. It's also important to point out in both Scotland and Wales the areas of LFA land in comparison to other agricultural land is much greater. And as one of the speakers pointed out today, that the limitations on the use of that land are much greater than within non-LFA land. So most of a larger proportion of the land in Wales and Scotland will be grass with few other options. And again, the smart way of using that land, in my mind, is in a multifunctional way to produce both high quality protein to feed ourselves alongside carbon capture and landscape and nature. And but the impact of the deal will, I think, disproportionately affect Wales and Scotland more.
Thank you. And Sean?
I really have nothing I can add to that. Just to emphasize the point, agriculture is a larger proportion of the Welsh and Scottish economy, and within those agricultural industries, beef and sheep are a much bigger proportion than they are in England. So yes, the straight answer is if this deal is damaging for UK agriculture, it's a great deal more damaging for Welsh and Scottish agriculture.
Yes, indeed, and our communities are so much more dependent, I should say, than on agriculture and tourism, which are both low-paid industries. And the constituency which I represent, of course, being Welsh-speaking, this has a particular impact on that. I'd like to turn, if I may, to Dmitry. What I'd just be interested in is how could you compare the sort of trade arrangements that Australia has with, say, Middle Eastern countries and South Asia countries, with those which belong to the UK, with perhaps an idea as to what the devolved government should be doing to promote their own sectors here in the future. I understand it's been very hard to break into the Dubai market, for example.
I mean, this is not necessarily my field, so I'm giving you an absolute sort of sky-high overview of things I have caught out of the corner of my eye. But Australia has been investing in trade promotion, specifically with this aim of breaking into these markets. It's been doing that through basically I would say a two-pronged strategy. There is an organization called Austrade, which is the government trade promotion body that basically employs staff on the ground. And their role is to firstly promote Australian production, secondly to encourage investment into Australia, and thirdly to work almost as consultants. I think it's often on a fee-for-service basis, market entry consultants, effectively. How do you navigate the bureaucracy? How do you navigate the cultural norms? How do you navigate all of that if you are an Australian firm that wants to sell into Dubai? Because it's not straightforward. As you can imagine, selling into China is, you need all of the help you can get to navigate the peculiarities of the Chinese system, avoid the pitfalls, avoid running foul of all of those things. So Australia invests in effectively government expertise in helping firms do that directly, while at the same time running commercial campaigns to promote Australian lamb or Australian beef and Australian production as a brand. Ironically, marketing it in a lot of the ways that I think the farmers on this call would market their production, as cleaner, as pesticide-free where that's relevant, as sort of the organic solution compared to what is being produced in, say, Chinese horticulture. So they do that. And then additionally, we have very, very active, as you do, our equivalent of the NFU, our equivalent of the Red Meat Association, the Meat and Livestock Australia, maintains trade missions all over the world who basically promote and lobby on behalf of the Australian red meat industry, identify the actual problems in an export chain that might be preventing exports, which are often not what you think they would be. The specific thing that is preventing an export being viable is often not the most visible barrier, but something in the way that customs operates or some regulation. And so they identify those, they lobby to get them removed, they bring them to the government's attention. specifically for Scotland, for Scotland and Wales, look, it's hard to know to recommend, because I think as Sean and I think Phil and others have suggested, I think the issues are going to be primarily at home. The issue is, how can Scotland and Wales influence policy in London and in Westminster in a way that protects the interests of their, that is objective one. Promoting Scotch and Welsh production abroad is good, but that's not where the fire is. So I'm sorry, that's not super helpful.
Okay, no, it is very helpful. I mean, your point, I think, there about the need to be able to influence Westminster, which I think both Philippa and I would have quite a lot to say on that if we had the time. But could you just give me, I mean, and I'm aware this isn't your area, you may not have expected this question, but that quantification, the sense of how much out there the UK is compared to all those activities you described with Australia.
Yeah, sure. So I mean, this is questions about kind of the scale of FCDO and others' work. I know, for example, that the UK, in just about every mission it has around the world, has locally engaged staff that work on market access issues. So they're specifically for when a UK firm can't get into, is having a problem at the border, for example. So they are there. Just generally, I mean, FCDO and now DIT, but the UK diplomatic network is probably second to none in terms of just the quality, the breadth, the reach. So the people are there. How they're being utilized. What I have heard third hand from people, from business owners who have been considering moving to the UK or looking to the UK, is that historically a lot of the support has been very surface level, a kind of, brochure on how people in the UK speak English and the rule of law is great and we're part of the European Union, which is convenient. And that really needs to be dialed up to a 12. That needs to be dialed up to bespoke advice from people who get it. But certainly the quality of the personnel is there. It just needs a lot of investment and some direction, I think, from the top.
Okay, I have a load more questions. I think I'll leave it for there now. I think it really is the role of the devolved governments in this. We haven't got the time to touch on it here, but I think it is significant. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks so much, Liz. That's absolutely right. And sorry to have to cut you short on that. Can I pass over now, please, to Professor Shira-West?
Hello, thank you, everyone. This has been completely fascinating. And I want to go back to you, Dmitry, and ask you if you can say a little bit about what the best practice is for consultation on trade deals, and in your experience. Can you say a little bit about that?
Well, let me begin by saying that absolutely nobody is getting this right. Doing trade consultations is incredibly hard. The way that trade policy generally works is that the people most affected by it have the least time to tell you about their needs. A barrier at the border impacts a small business run with 15 employees trying to get a bespoke product over a border, much more than it does a gigantic firm that can hire, Dr. Jazuska and a whole team to help them mitigate and has economies of scale. So everybody struggles with this. The European Union has moved to significantly more transparency at some key stages. They will release their negotiating objectives in a way they never used to. This was a reform, I think, really introduced by Cecilia Malmström when she was DG Trade after the backlash to the EU-US deal from civil society, the TTIP. So there's the EU is a lot more transparent now. They publish their negotiating mandate. They will sometimes even publish their core text. But the real challenge is you can have all of the roundtables, you can have all of the submission requests that you want. The question is that actually shaping really three things? The negotiating mandate, the cabinet submission that goes up from DIT that says, here is our negotiating mandate, here are our key offensive and defensive red lines. Secondly, your initial market access offer. So what your opening bid is in terms of what you're prepared to open your market in to kick off the negotiations, and your opening request. So what you're asking the other side for as your most ambitious dream outcome. And actually translating that input and making sure people have a real sense of identifying where the actual problems for them are in that market is incredibly difficult and requires a lot more than I think a lot of governments, in fact, most governments will err on the side of a box ticking exercise where they can say, look at how public we are, witness our openness, and then really the decisions are being made in other places. I will just add one plug for something the New Zealand government is doing, which I think is great, where they have a portal where any business can register any technical barrier to trade. So any administrative or regulatory thing that is preventing them, that is hurting them in another market. And that is open 24/7 and it's digital and they look at it and they use it. And that gives them, that's almost worth more than a single kind of round of roundtables and submissions from academics. But it's, no one knows how to do this right. I'm sorry.
I didn't think they did, but that's a very clear answer. Thank you. And just following on from that question, and I think we've heard a bit about this already, but let's just get it clear from Phil and Jilly. How much consultation was there in your experience with UK farmers about the impact of this trade deal?
Again, I'm quite happy to go first, Julie, if you like, but just, I think it's been absolutely minimal. Most farmers have learnt about what's going on in the farming press, I guess. I would say that there's been an attempt to draw some of our organisations into trade advisory groups, but and that's very welcome. But I'd have to say that they're more like trade information groups rather than advisory groups. And if you look at what's coming out from the Australia deal, you'd have to say that any advice that I've fed into that group has not been taken into account, I'm afraid. So, but the average farmers, I think, and agriculture generally has been consulted very, very little, I think, in terms of the impact, or whether they would favour this approach or not. Most people feel that they're being sold down the river, to be honest.
Right, thank you. Jilly, would you agree with that?
Sorry, I would absolutely agree with that. I think there has been some discussions with the NFU, but I think it's been much more after the event. I'm not sure how much discussion has taken place with DEFRA, and I think, I've also mentioned the British Meat Processors Association and Red Tractor. And of course, there's a huge amount of market data that the levy boards, HDB, and Quality Meat Scotland and Welsh Beef also have, and representing also the lamb sector. So it's been really disappointing that kind of it's now, having agreed the deal in principle, now the nitty gritty is really critical. And I hope that we'll come on to kind of talk about some solutions on this to reduce the impacts on the British agriculture, because in specific sectors, it is serious. It is deeply serious because of what is stacking up behind in the other large exporting countries who will expect these volumes and the what I think has now become leniency on animal welfare standards, environment, and probably climate change. There's some very big gaps on these standards and farm assurances. So and also, as the point I made earlier, which is about auditing. It's fine to send a form and such like, but are those supply chains and are those processes and the product going to be sufficiently audited and checked?
Thank you very much. In the interest of time, Caroline, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and my apologies that we are running very slightly over. Our witnesses are very excellent, and it's hard to stop you because we want the information. But I apologise for that, and pass over the floor now to Aidan Connolly.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you very much to our witnesses today. Dmitry, I'm going to ask you a couple of quick ones. Firstly, what is the extent that Northern Ireland is affected differently by the new trade arrangements due to the Northern Ireland Protocol, or the Protocol on Ireland and Northern Ireland, to go with its full title? And secondly, what Leila was asking earlier on about the effects on consumers, and it was mostly around meat, and I know that's a huge part of this deal. But will there be other effects for UK and Northern Ireland consumers, possible positives, negatives, or will they really see much difference? I'm thinking of things like wine, skincare products, that sort of thing that have been mentioned recently.
Sure. So again, we don't have the full text, and so we don't know. But on tariffs, the Northern Ireland Protocol basically provides two options where there is a significant difference in the tariff that would have been paid had the thing been going into the EU versus going into the UK, which is what is going to happen here, because the UK will be eliminating the tariff and the EU will, at least until it gets its deal done, which doesn't seem to be sort of anytime soon, will maintain that tariff. Because that tariff difference will be over 3%, that will be charged to the goods moving into Northern Ireland, unless if that good is staying in Northern Ireland, the UK government can pay it on behalf of the importer. That's my understanding of how the Northern Ireland Protocol will work. So effectively, for something that you can prove is headed to a Belfast supermarket and then your plate, the UK government has the option within state aid rules to take that onto the public purse rather than passing it on to consumers. But for something,
will that still fall under reachback then and de minimis?
Yes, but so it'll exceed the de minimis because the difference is over 3%, I believe. Yeah. But it is reachback, is my understanding. But I am very much a neophyte at this. I suspect people in your building would be far better qualified to answer that question. As to other benefits for Northern Ireland consumers, again, I would think probably at the margins. The UK's tariffs on a lot of things outside agriculture weren't high, and it's unlikely this deal will significantly alter standards directly. So anything that was banned will continue to be banned. Anything that was screened will probably continue to be screened to some extent. So I don't know if there's going to be a huge benefit to Northern Ireland consumers from the deal.
Okay, and just because I have an extra minute, if you don't mind, on the we've talked a lot about tariffs here and about 0-0 and that sort of thing. And one of the things that's I have it written on the wall somewhere here: zero tariff, zero quota does not mean zero cost. The non-tariff barriers in this haven't really got much of an airing this morning. Those non-tariff barriers coming from Australia, obviously, there's going to be the ones on food miles and all that sort of thing. Will the fact that removing tariffs have a great sort of impact on consumers, or will those non-tariff barriers sort of negate even some of the tariff wins?
I think if anything negates the tariff loss, it'll be a combination of some of those non-tariff barriers. So for example, the hormone ban prevents selling beef with hormones, which are cheaper than those without. They're more efficient. So that sort of prevents that segment of the Australian market from selling into Northern Ireland or the UK. So it'll have that effect. But then a lot of other factors, such as just distance, market size, other more lucrative markets elsewhere. So those two will combine. If anything is to combine to undermine, it'll be those two things together. I will say that Australia has been selling all of these kind of products into the UK for some time, just within its existing quotas. So it knows how to navigate these non-tariff barriers and is able to do it profitably within its existing quota allowances. So clearly the barriers aren't insurmountable.
Thank you very much.
Thanks,
Thank you, sir.
Thanks very much, Aidan. And then finally, if I could come to Jeff Mackey, Dr. Jeff Mackey. Who I know has been having a bit of Wi-Fi problems, so I hope that he can...
Thank you very much, Chair. I much appreciate it. This morning has been a riveting expose of a number of topics, and as Spike Milligan used to say, the difficult questions to finish. Given what we've heard and what there is going forward, I wonder, would the panelists like to very briefly suggest, given what we now know about the Australia trade deal, what should happen next? What should happen now? Could we actually start with Séan, please?
Well, thank you for that. As brief as I can be, if you take most of what you've heard this morning, it has amounted to a defensive policy, an attempt to try and stop what I think is inevitable from happening. If you were to accept my point of view, that's forlorn hope. You're not going to stop it for lots of reasons. Instead of a defensive attitude, we've got to switch to an offensive one. And Dmitry went through a number of options, but I think he missed one actually. If our standards are so high in this country, and if we believe that our standards appeal particularly to middle class consumers, and knowing that there's going to be some 4 billion middle class consumers around the world by 2030, I really think that if we were serious about helping our industry, we would put much more attention towards exporting, and we would do that behind a food policy. You may think, we have a food policy. You may think Henry Dimbleby is going to come up with one. I caution against that. We have a nutritional policy. We have a social policy. We have an environmental policy. We do not have a food policy. You know, if we were talking about the car industry, what we have would be policies looking at yellow lines outside schools or whatever. We are not dealing with the production and competitiveness of our food industry. So my simple answer, but I think the chances of it are very slim, is the government decides it has to adopt a serious policy towards agriculture in the same way as it is to electric cars.
Dmitry, we need to go on the offensive and we need a proper policy. What do you think?
Look, I think Séan's right in the long term. It is an option, and I think if it's worth pushing the government to explore how it can support it. I will say though that there is a transition period, opening up foreign markets, building. What Séan's talking about isn't just selling UK beef to consumers at the lowest price. That you don't necessarily need to do a whole bunch of marketing work to do. You simply head to the marketplace. I'm oversimplifying, but you know, you have the lowest price, that speaks for itself. What Séan is talking about is building up a global reputation and a global awareness of that reputation to the point where consumers are prepared, consumers in countries very far away are prepared to pay more, perhaps significantly more, because they trust and they want specifically UK produce because of how good they know it to be. That is a marathon. It is not a sprint. In some ways, I guess it's a marathon you have to sprint because you have to ingest so much work to get there. And it's so hard to get there. But there is a long question of what happens before that brand is established and what happens to all of those. So while I definitely take his point, and it's definitely something that's worth looking into, there's also the question of what do you do in the interim? And what do you do if that roll of the dice doesn't quite pan out the way you hope, given that I think a lot of people here and a lot of the British public have as a policy objective maintaining the British countryside, maintaining British standards of how that you treat animals and all of these things. What do you do in the interim, and what do you do if it doesn't work?
Thank you, Dmitry. Jilly, it's quite simple to sprint a marathon. We can move beef. What do you think?
Okay, so I'm going to talk about our journey. We want to sell high quality beef into our domestic market. And I'm just going to say about what we're doing now to be sustainable. And we've looked at our cost of production. We are now going organic on our grass-based beef, because we can secure contracts here in retail contracts and food service hospitality for organic beef, which will give us up to 80 pence per kilo more than we receive at the moment, and on the current base price. And that is our route to sustainability, where we can continue to do these great environmental things, regenerative farming, zero antibiotic use, and looking after hedgerows, trees, silvopasture, orchards, birds, bees, hares, owls, the whole works, and be supported by an environmental, the ELM scheme, the environmental land management. That is our route, financially costed, to survive, succeed, and diversify. On that product at the moment, the only option that I think that we have got for perhaps an export opportunity, and I think this really shows up how individual producers like ourselves and sheep producers, lamb producers, America and kind of antibiotic zero assured beef, which would probably come under, it would definitely come under soil association, but also pastures for life assurance, certified assurance. That at the moment is probably the most, where consumers will pay premiums for that type of product. That seems to be our only export option. However, but where do I want to sell? Because it's about telling our story. I want to be on menus, in the hospitality. We've had 100 chefs here on this farm 2 years ago in Great British Beef Week. Brilliant. From the big hotel chains, the Hiltons, the others, from independent, from restaurants, right across the country, 100 chefs all day, getting close on farm, seeing butchery displays, learning about how we produce our beef. So actually, where do we actually need to win the argument? It is in our domestic market, because we need to be close to our consumers. It's about nutrition, it's about protein, and it's about sustainability. And at the same time, downloading loads more carbon and being sustainable. Surely that is the right way to do this, not just import from anywhere in the world below our standards.
Jilly, thank you very much. I'm duty bound because of time and everything else not to pick up on a range of points that you've thrown at me there. Frankly, I'd like another couple of hours to explore a lot of the points you've just raised, but not today. Phil, as a last comment, just to finish off with, given what we've learned on Australia, what next for you and yours?
So I think we need to look at things on two levels. I think that we're not facing a particularly we haven't painted a particularly rosy picture in terms of the Australia deal, but all's not over yet. I still think there's a lot of work that needs to be done to try to make sure that the detail of this deal works out in a way that that we can live with and we can work alongside. And there are some details that we need to be pushing for. One of those is to try to make sure that the tonnage that the zero tariff rate tonnage that is being given to Australia is worked out on a carcass weight equivalent. So that they can't just fill it with particular specific premium products. So we need to try to secure that. We need to try to secure some terms of controls in terms of whether the product coming in is fresh or frozen. And currently, Australia's export into the European Union would be somewhere in a region of 80% frozen and 25% fresh. And we'd like to see some controls to maintain that balance, because the frozen product is far less likely to compete with our premium products on the marketplace. And in terms of seasonality and when products actually arrive at our shores as well, we should be pushing to make sure there's a system of licensing so that we limit the amount that would come in that would compete against our peak seasons of production. So there are a few things that we need to do to try to make sure that the deal is as limited in terms of its damage on our industry as possible. But then just going back to the points that Jilly made very eloquently, really, I think there is a lot that the industry will end up having to do for itself. I think it'll have no choice. And that will be about building those closer connections with our public and our consumers, making sure that we maintain and further build our domestic market, because we know that that domestic market is the most stable market that we've got in relation to all of our markets, export and import. So we need to do what we can to build and maintain that domestic market and get more loyalty towards our standards of production. And we need to continue to build export markets, again, based on our reputation and quality and high environmental and animal welfare standards.
Thank you. David, it's been a long morning. It's been an interesting morning.
What was he going to say?
It's been a riveting morning for some of us. You have the last word. What next?
Thanks very much, Jeff. I agree with Sean that I think this is, although obviously this is agreement in principle, it's essentially tinkering around at the edges. So what the government should be focused on is other much more important macro issues, and these are in their gift. So Sean says we don't have a food policy, although we will get the Dimbleby report in 2 weeks' time. Let's see if they produce a food policy from that. We don't have a trade strategy, which sounds bizarre, but we don't. The trade strategy, as far as I can see it, is to sign as many FTAs as possible. That's not a trade strategy. So how are we going to get a trade strategy? So this week is 4 months since the Trade and Agriculture Commission produced their report. The government said they would respond to it in due course. I took that to be a month. We are 4 months down the track, and that the Trade and Agriculture Commission asked some very, very clear questions and gave clear recommendations, 32 recommendations to the government. And the reason why they haven't responded to that is because they don't have a trade strategy. What is in the gift of the government to do? They can sort out to try and make the impacts of this trade agreement less impactful. So they can sort out their procurement policy. At the moment, did you know that our procurement policy does not forbid procurement managers to source from overseas? So Jilly mentioned about Australian beef and lamb possibly going into hospitals and schools. That is perfectly legal. DEFRA know that. They want to change it. So that's a really important thing to change so that we have a good procurement policy. A labelling policy. So DEFRA have said that they will introduce mandatory method of production labelling, and they will have a consultation very soon. And again, this is all about giving consumers information. If you want to have a pure marketplace that operates, the consumer needs to make a choice, and they need to have that information before they make a choice. And then finally, the one good thing, and I mentioned this earlier, in the model animal welfare chapter, which I believe will be one of the best in any FTAs, is that Australia and the UK will collaborate at the OIE, at the WTO and other international meetings to get animal welfare on the agenda. And that will be a good combination. That is a member of the Cairns group, the food liberalising group, as well as the UK, both working together to get these discussions about animal welfare at the WTO and at the OIE, and to get these things sorted out. And I think that will open up export opportunities. So there are a number of practical things that lies in the government's gift, and I look forward to them taking those measures as soon as possible. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Stirring words. Thank you for your patience, Chair.
Thanks so much, Jeff, and let me thank everybody for their patience. I do apologise that we've run over 15 minutes, but it was just such a stimulating session with so much information. Personally, I have learned so much, and so I just really want to thank our witnesses so very, very much, and we'll make sure that your evidence absolutely is reflected in the recommendations that we make and in our voices to Parliament and government, because I think if we were worried about the trade agreement before we started this session, again, speaking for myself, I am positively alarmed now. I know that the impacts, as we've heard throughout the morning session, are likely to be hitting the devolved nations more than most. And I know that will be a big issue that we want to come back to in a dedicated session in the future on the devolved nations. But a big thank you again to all of you. It's been a fascinating session. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much.